A man who built his own empire not with Wall Street deals, but with heroin smuggled inside the coffins of dead American soldiers. At his peak, Frank Lucas controlled Harlem's drug trade, earning millions a day and living like a king. He sat ringside at the Muhammad Ali fight in a $100,000 fur coat, a symbol of power that made him untouchable, or so he thought. This is the rise and fall of Frank Lucas, the real American gangster, and the very empire he built would become the reason for his destruction. A man who built his own empire didn't begin his life surrounded by fortune. Frank Lucas's story starts far away from the bright lights of Harlem. It begins in the small, segregated town of LaGrange, North Carolina, where he was born on September 9th, 1930. The Lucas family was poor, not poor in the casual way people sometimes describe, but poor in the way where every meal, every dollar, and every opportunity was uncertain. The South of the 1930s was brutal for a black family. Jim Crow laws were still alive, and racism wasn't hidden in whispers. It was daily reality. Frank grew up watching his father, a kind but powerless man, working hard for almost nothing. He chopped wood, took farm jobs, and struggled to keep food on the table. Despite all his effort, the Lucas family lived in a shack with no insulation, no real comfort, and little hope for change. Frank himself would later say that the image burned into his mind was seeing his family go hungry while the white landowners and businessmen in town thrived. He hated that feeling of being powerless. From an early age, ambition burned inside him. He wanted more than survival, more than scraping by. But ambition, in a place like LaGrange, had nowhere safe to go. Frank's first lessons in life came not from school books or church sermons, but from the streets and the fields. He grew up fast. By the time he was a teenager, he was already hustling in small ways, stealing food, running errands for older boys, finding angles just to get a few coins in his pocket. It wasn't just poverty that shaped him. It was humiliation. Frank often told the story of watching his cousin murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan. The cousin was only 12 years old. According to Frank, the boy had looked at a white woman the wrong way. That moment filled him with a lifelong anger, a conviction that nobody, not the Klan, not the white landowners, not the government, would ever hold power over him again. The seeds of rebellion were planted, and with them a dangerous lesson. If the system was built against you, then you had to beat the system by breaking it. By his late teens, Frank had already outgrown LaGrange. The town was too small for his ambitions. He knew that if he stayed, his future would be trapped between poverty and violence. Like many black men of his generation, he looked north. Harlem was calling the capital of black culture, music, and opportunity, the place where fortunes were made and legends were born. So, sometime in the late 1940s, Frank packed up what little he had and boarded a bus bound for New York City. He arrived with almost nothing, no real connections, no job, no plan beyond survival. But Harlem was alive with energy, and Frank could feel the possibility in the air. The streets were crowded with music spilling out of jazz clubs, vendors shouting on corners, and gamblers running dice games in alleys. If LaGrange had been a prison, Harlem felt like a chance at freedom. But Harlem was also dangerous. It wasn't the Harlem of Renaissance poets and jazz alone. By the time Frank arrived, heroin was already coursing through the veins of the community. Crime families, hustlers, and crooked cops ran the streets. Harlem was an open market for anyone bold enough to claim a piece. Frank, young and ambitious, quickly fell into the rhythm. He started small running scams, committing petty robberies, and finding work as muscle for anyone who would pay. He was reckless, but he was also sharp. He studied the way the street worked. He watched how numbers runners collected money, how dealers cut their product, how clubs made money under the table. Harlem was his new classroom, and survival was his teacher. But more than survival, Harlem taught him strategy. He saw that the men who truly ruled weren't the ones who fought in the street or flashed their guns. The ones with real power were organized, disciplined, and patient. They blended into the shadows, pulling strings while others took the fall. Frank wasn't there yet. He was still just another hustler, scraping by, getting into fights, dodging police, and learning through trial and error. But he carried something that many others didn't: patience and ambition. He knew he wasn't destined to stay small time. And Harlem, in its own brutal way, was about to introduce him to the man who would change his life: Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Harlem was alive, unpredictable, and dangerous. And in the late 1940s and 1950s, one man's shadow loomed larger than anyone else's: Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. To the people of Harlem, Bumpy was a paradox, feared as a gangster, respected as a protector, and known as someone who balanced ruthlessness with a strange kind of honor. He was the unofficial mayor of Harlem, and every hustler, dealer, and gambler moved under his watch. For Frank Lucas, meeting Bumpy Johnson wasn't just luck, it was destiny. The story goes that Frank, still a small-time hustler, crossed paths with Bumpy during one of his street-level scams. Bumpy noticed the young man's boldness, his ability to think quickly under pressure, and his unshakable confidence. Where most kids would shrink under the glare of a Harlem kingpin, Frank didn't flinch. That made an impression. Bumpy took him in not as a partner, not yet, but as a student. Frank became his driver, bodyguard, and errand man. He listened more than he spoke, watching every move Bumpy made. He absorbed the lessons others missed: discipline, control, patience. Because Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was a strategist. He knew that power wasn't about muscle alone. It was about respect, reputation, and leverage. He controlled numbers, rackets, dope lines, and gambling dens. But he also gave back to Harlem's people. He handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving, slipped cash to struggling families, and kept the Italian Mafia in check within his territory. Frank learned all of it. He saw how Bumpy maintained order by being both feared and loved. He noticed how Bumpy never let greed blind him, and how he handled enemies with precision, not recklessness. Frank was being groomed, even if nobody said it out loud. Ah, For years, Frank rode by Bumpy's side, watching him run Harlem like a king. But power doesn't last forever. By the mid-1960s, Bumpy Johnson's health began to fail. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy collapsed in a Harlem restaurant while eating fried chicken and died of a heart attack. To the community, it was the end of an era. To Frank Lucas, it was the beginning of something much larger. Frank knew what came next. Harlem would be carved up by rivals with the Italian Mafia waiting to swoop in and control everything. But Frank had other ideas. He didn't want to be just another hustler fighting for scraps. He wanted to be bigger than Bumpy, bigger than the Mafia, bigger than anyone who had ever touched the drug game in Harlem. And he had a plan. Frank Lucas's genius wasn't in simply selling heroin. It was in the way he thought about the supply chain. For decades, the Italian Mafia had controlled the heroin pipeline into New York. They imported it, cut it, distributed it, and sold it to black dealers at high prices. By the time it reached Harlem streets, it was weak and overpriced. But Frank saw an opportunity. Why pay the Mafia when he could go straight to the source? Through contacts made during his time with Bumpy, Frank connected with soldiers and suppliers tied to the Vietnam War. Southeast Asia, specifically the Golden Triangle region, where Laos, Thailand, and Burma meet, was producing some of the purest heroin in the world. Soldiers stationed there knew the routes, the contacts, and the risks, and many of them were more than willing to make money on the side. Frank made a bold move. He flew to Bangkok, Thailand, and cut a direct deal with a supplier named Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former U.S. Army sergeant who had married into Frank's family. Ike had connections on the ground, men who could get the heroin straight from the jungles and into packages ready for shipment. This was revolutionary. No middlemen, no mafia, no inflated prices. Frank could buy heroin at $4,000 a kilo, sell it in New York for $300,000, and still undercut every rival dealer on the street. But how to smuggle it into the United States without detection? That's where Frank's most infamous innovation came in. Using his military contacts, he arranged for heroin to be hidden inside the coffins of American soldiers killed in Vietnam. The logic was brutal, but effective. Nobody would dare open a casket draped in the American flag. Shipments came in undetected, flown on U.S. military planes straight into the States. To this day, debate continues about how widespread the coffin smuggling was. Some claim it was exaggerated, that not every shipment used this method. But one thing is certain, Frank's supply line was secure, efficient, and almost untouchable. And once the heroin hit Harlem, Frank branded it. He called it Blue Magic. Pure, uncut heroin stronger than anything the Mafia sold and marketed like a product. People knew the name, trusted the quality, and lined up for it. Frank wasn't just selling drugs. He was running a business empire with a brand identity. By the early 1970s, Blue Magic dominated New York streets. Dealers lined up to buy from Frank because his product was both cheaper and stronger. Addicts knew the name and chased it. Overnight, Frank Lucas became one of the most powerful drug lords in America. But power comes with enemies. The Mafia was enraged. Frank had cut into their business, humiliated them by proving a black man could outmaneuver their centuries-old networks. Rivals in Harlem wanted him dead. Law enforcement, already alarmed by the heroin epidemic, began noticing that something unusual was happening. Too much pure product was hitting the streets, and the name Blue Magic was spreading like wildfire. Frank didn't care. He doubled down, expanding his network, laundering money through businesses, and living like royalty. Yet every bold move carried a cost. Cutting out the Mafia gave him freedom, but it also painted a target on his back. Cutting out the Mafia was dangerous, but it made him unstoppable. That was the reality of Frank Lucas's rise. Unstoppable, but increasingly surrounded by enemies he couldn't see. By the early 1970s, Harlem had a new king. The name on everyone's lips wasn't Bumpy Johnson anymore. It wasn't the Italians either. It was Frank Lucas. And the product that crowned him wasn't alcohol or gambling or protection rackets. It was Blue Magic. Blue Magic wasn't just heroin. It was a brand, a guarantee. Frank had marketed it like Coca-Cola, turning a poison into a household name. In a market flooded with weak, diluted product, Blue Magic was something different, pure, powerful, and unforgettable. Addicts could spot the difference immediately, and word spread across the boroughs like wildfire. Dealers lined up to buy it wholesale. Users demanded it by name. And for Frank Lucas, the money poured in like nothing Harlem had ever seen. At his peak, Lucas claimed he was making $1 million a day. That figure has been debated, but the truth is clear. His fortune was staggering. In an era when a middle-class home cost $25,000, Frank was earning enough to buy an entire block in cash every single morning. He had stash houses overflowing with cash, so much money that he struggled to hide it. Bundles of bills stuffed into shopping bags, hidden in closets, even buried in the ground. Frank wasn't shy about spending it either. He bought luxury cars, Cadillacs, Lincolns, a fleet of Mercedes. He purchased homes across New York and New Jersey, one of them a sprawling estate in Teaneck, where he lived like a suburban mogul. He invested in nightclubs, dry cleaners, and even livestock farms. He wanted to look like a businessman, not just a street hustler. But he also wanted to enjoy it. Harlem nightlife became his playground. He strolled into clubs wearing tailor-made suits, dripping in jewelry, flanked by bodyguards and beautiful women. His brothers, cousins, and family members, the so-called country boys he brought up from North Carolina, were now his trusted inner circle. He gave them jobs, money, and positions in his empire. To Frank, family came first, and keeping the operation in the family meant loyalty. Still, the most iconic moment of Frank Lucas's peak didn't happen in a Harlem club. It happened under the bright lights of Madison Square Garden. On March 8th, 1971, the world watched as Muhammad Ali fought Joe Frazier in what was called the fight of the century. The crowd was a who's who of celebrities, politicians, and power brokers. And sitting front row, Closer than even some of the wealthiest men in America was Frank Lucas. He wasn't in a modest suit. He wasn't trying to blend in. He wore a full-length chinchilla fur coat with a matching hat, reportedly worth over $100,000, a staggering amount of money at the time. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. Who was this man sitting ringside in a coat fit for royalty, surrounded by celebrities? For Frank, it was a declaration. He had arrived. He wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. He was Harlem's king, and he wanted the world to see it. But that coat would become his undoing. Up until that night, law enforcement had barely noticed Frank Lucas. He had been smart, no flashy cars with custom plates, no mafia-style meetings in fancy restaurants. He kept his head down, living like a quiet businessman despite his fortune. But the chinchilla coat changed everything. Detectives in the audience that night, including Richie Roberts of the DEA, spotted him. They didn't know his name, but they knew from that moment on, whoever this man was, he was somebody worth investigating. The spotlight that made him famous would also expose him. Still, during his peak, Frank Lucas ruled Harlem like an emperor. Blue Magic's grip on the streets was absolute. Rivals tried to compete, but they couldn't match his prices or his quality. Even the Mafia had to admit he had outmaneuvered them. To protect his empire, Frank moved carefully. He built layers of protection lieutenants, soldiers, stash houses spread across the city. His country boys were loyal and ruthless, guarding the operation with military-like discipline. Frank himself was cautious, never using telephones for business, always meeting face to face and keeping his words few. And yet, the bigger he grew, the harder it became to stay invisible. Addicts overdosed in record numbers, hospitals filled with heroin-related cases, and Blue Magic became both infamous and iconic. Politicians began to pressure law enforcement to crack down. The DEA expanded its resources, and in back rooms across New York, the Mafia plotted revenge. Frank didn't slow down. He believed his operation was untouchable. After all, his supply line was direct, his family was loyal, and his product was unmatched. He had outsmarted everyone so far. Why would it stop now? But history shows us a dangerous pattern. The higher a king rises, the more eyes turn toward his throne. And for Frank Lucas, those eyes were everywhere: the Mafia watching with resentment, law enforcement circling like vultures, and even men within his own circle tempted by greed. At the height of his power, Frank Lucas felt unstoppable. But the very empire that made him a legend was already beginning to crack under its own weight. At the peak of his empire, Frank Lucas believed he had cracked the code. He had built a system that bypassed the Mafia, outsmarted the police, and flooded New York with a product so pure, so addictive, that it practically sold itself. The money was endless. The power was intoxicating. And the chinchilla coat moment at the Ali Frazier fight had, in his mind, cemented him as Harlem's king. But power attracts enemies, and in the underworld there is no such thing as an untouchable empire. The first cracks began to show not from the Mafia or the DEA, but from inside his own walls. The very family members Frank trusted most, the country boys, were growing reckless. With millions of dollars flowing in, discipline began to slip. Cousins flaunted their wealth in Harlem, buying cars, jewelry, even broadcasting their connections to Frank. What had once been a quiet, tightly run operation was beginning to shine like a spotlight in the dark. And that spotlight caught the attention of the law. Enter Richie Roberts, a detective with the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. Richie wasn't the typical New York cop of the era. He wasn't on the take, he wasn't easy to bribe, and he wasn't intimidated by the Mafia. He had built a reputation as an incorruptible investigator in a time when corruption was the norm. And when he saw Frank Lucas sitting front row in that $100,000 chinchilla coat, Richie's instincts told him everything he needed to know. This man is no ordinary gangster. He's bigger. From that moment on, Frank Lucas went from invisible to priority target. The investigation was slow at first. Frank had done well hiding his paper trail. He didn't use banks, he didn't talk on phones, and he never personally touched the drugs once they hit New York. His network of stash houses and family-run operations made it nearly impossible to pin him down. But law enforcement had patience. They followed the money, the cars, the sudden appearance of wealth among men who, on paper, had no jobs. They tracked cousins in flashy suits and uncles who suddenly owned real estate. Piece by piece, they built a map that pointed to one man, Frank Lucas. The Mafia also began to stir. Frank's decision to cut them out of the heroin trade had been bold, even genius. But it was also unforgivable. The Italians weren't used to being sidelined. They had ruled Harlem for decades through fear and connections. And here was Frank Lucas, a black man from North Carolina, not only competing with them, but beating them at their own game. Rumors spread that contracts were being placed on Frank's life. Rivals whispered that the Mafia wanted him dead, and soon. Frank, however, seemed unshaken. He believed his family structure, his loyalty network, and his reputation in Harlem made him untouchable. But paranoia began to creep in. He tightened his inner circle. He moved more cautiously, and yet the empire grew harder to control. Law enforcement's big break came not from New York, but from across the ocean. For years, Frank had relied on his Golden Triangle connection, a direct heroin supply line from Southeast Asia. U.S. military planes carried coffins back from Vietnam, and hidden among the dead were kilos of heroin wrapped and concealed with precision. It was a system so daring, so unimaginable, that for a time no one believed it could be true. But eventually, whispers leaked, an informant spoke, and law enforcement began to piece together the impossible truth. Frank Lucas was smuggling heroin through the very heart of the American military system. The DEA was stunned. This wasn't just a drug dealer. This was a man who had penetrated the deepest veins of U.S. power, turning a war into a supply chain. And once that information surfaced, Frank's days of operating in the shadows were numbered. Still, Frank believed he could manage it. He had money, he had connections, he had lawyers, and he had Harlem behind him. But money and power can only buy so much time when the government decides you're a target. By the mid-1970s, the investigation had built enough evidence for a strike. Undercover agents, wiretaps, and surveillance had created a web too tight for Frank to escape. And in 1975, law enforcement finally made their move. In a massive raid, Frank Lucas's empire came crashing down. Homes were stormed, stash houses raided. Millions in cash were seized in one infamous moment. Officers discovered more than $500,000 in cash hidden inside Frank's home, stuffed into shoeboxes and closets like loose change. The man who once claimed to earn $1 million a day was suddenly in handcuffs. Frank's trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as the mastermind of the most sophisticated heroin operation in American history. They accused him of smuggling hundreds of kilos, of causing untold deaths in New York streets, of building an empire on the suffering of addicts. The evidence was overwhelming. And the jury didn't take long. Frank Lucas was convicted on federal and state drug charges. The sentence was devastating. 70 years in prison. For most men, that would have been the end. The empire gone. The fortune seized. The legend reduced to a cell. But Frank Lucas was no ordinary man, and his story was far from over. Inside prison, Frank faced a choice: remain loyal to the code of silence or break it. The Mafia had one rule: never talk, never betray, never cooperate. To snitch was to sign your death warrant. Harlem had similar codes. Street respect was built on silence. But Frank Lucas was pragmatic. He saw the walls closing in. He saw the Mafia's hatred, the DEA's determination, and the long years stretching ahead of him. And he made a decision that would shock the underworld. Frank Lucas turned informant. He began cooperating with law enforcement, exposing corrupt police officers who had taken bribes, exposing dealers who had once worked under him, even exposing members of his own circle. His testimony led to the indictment of more than 100 corrupt NYPD officers. For law enforcement, it was a gold mine. For Harlem and the criminal underworld, it was a betrayal. But for Frank, it was survival. His cooperation cut his sentence dramatically. Within just a few years, he was released. The king, who had once built an empire from heroin, now walked free, though not without consequences. On the streets, respect for Frank Lucas was gone. The man who once ruled Harlem was now branded a snitch. Old friends turned their backs. Enemies waited in the shadows. And though he still had money hidden, his empire had crumbled. The heroin pipeline was gone. The family structure broken. The legend stained. Frank Lucas's downfall wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was symbolic of an era. The heroin epidemic of the 1970s devastated New York. Families torn apart, addicts lost in alleys and stairwells, violence spiraled. The product that made Frank rich also destroyed the community he came from. And in the end, he became a prisoner of the very system he thought he had mastered. His coat, his wealth, his empire all reduced to cautionary symbols in the story of crime in America. And yet, even in ruin, Frank Lucas remained unforgettable. His rise had been too bold, his methods too daring, his empire too vast to simply vanish into obscurity. The world would not forget the man they called the American Gangster. When the cell door closed behind him in the mid-1970s, most people believed Frank Lucas's story was over. 70 years was a death sentence for a man in his mid-40s. The empire he had built, the pipelines, the stash houses, the street network, collapsed overnight. Family members were either locked up, hiding, or scrambling to survive without him. The Mafia celebrated his downfall. Law enforcement called it a victory for justice. And Harlem mourned and cursed in equal measure. But Frank Lucas wasn't finished. Inside those walls, Frank did what he had always done. He calculated. He studied people, measured opportunity, and weighed risk against survival. He saw that his only way out wasn't through violence, but through cooperation. And so, in a move that would forever stain his legend, Frank chose betrayal over loyalty. By turning informant, he gave law enforcement the names of over 100 corrupt police officers, along with details about rival traffickers and criminal networks. It was one of the largest takedowns of crooked lawmen in New York's history. The government rewarded him the one thing he valued most: freedom. In 1981, less than a decade after his conviction, Frank Lucas walked free. But the world he re-entered was not the world he had left. Harlem had changed. The heroin trade he once controlled had splintered into chaos. Crack cocaine was rising, and the violence on the streets was worse than ever. His name was no longer whispered with awe, but with bitterness. To many in Harlem, Frank was a traitor, the man who broke the code, who turned on his own, who snitched to save himself. And yet, he was still Frank Lucas. He still had hidden money, though not nearly as much as the legends claimed. He still had the charisma, the sharp mind, and the hunger to live large. But freedom was a fragile thing. In 1984, only 3 years after his release, Frank was caught again. Another drug deal, another bust, another sentence, 7 years this time. It seemed the pattern of his life couldn't be broken. When he came out again in the early 1990s, Frank Lucas was no longer the king of Harlem. He was a man in his 60s, limping from old injuries, worn down by prison, and nearly forgotten by the streets he once ruled. But he wasn't irrelevant. His story still lingered whispered in barbershops, told in cautionary tales, mythologized in both admiration and disgust. There, and in time, Hollywood came calling. The legend of Frank Lucas reached a new generation in 2007, when Ridley Scott's film American Gangster hit theaters, starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas and Russell Crowe as Richie Roberts. The movie dramatized Frank's rise, his empire, and his eventual downfall. While Hollywood took liberties stretching truths, smoothing edges, inventing scenes, the film reintroduced Frank Lucas to the world as both a criminal genius and a flawed man chasing power. For Frank, the movie was a resurrection. Suddenly, he was back in the spotlight, doing interviews, appearing at premieres, and speaking as if his past had been a dark but proud achievement. He leaned into the myth, often embellishing stories, sometimes contradicting himself, but always selling the image of the American gangster. Some admired him. They saw him as a man who outsmarted the Mafia, built an empire against all odds, and lived the dream of wealth and power. Others despised him, calling him a poisoner of his own people, a man who profited from the suffering of addicts, who destroyed Harlem for personal gain. The truth, as always, was somewhere between myth and reality. But in his later years, Frank Lucas lived a life far different from the one in his prime. Gone were the million-dollar days. Gone were the mink coats, the front row seats, the army of family soldiers. Instead, he lived modestly in New Jersey, relying on disability checks and small amounts of money from appearances and interviews. His health deteriorated. He was confined to a wheelchair after a car accident in the 1980s. His once sharp frame grew frail. The man who once struck fear into Harlem now shuffled through life as a fragile old man. And yet, the aura never left him. When people saw Frank Lucas, they didn't see the wheelchair, they saw the ghost of Harlem's most infamous kingpin. He was invited to speak at schools, to tell a story as a warning against the life of crime. He gave interviews reflecting on his choices, sometimes claiming regret, other times still boasting of his brilliance. The question of legacy haunted him until the end. What did Frank Lucas leave behind? On one hand, he was a pioneer, the man who cut out the middleman, who built an empire through vision and audacity. He was proof that someone from nothing could rise to challenge the most powerful crime syndicates in America. On the other hand, he left behind a trail of destruction. His heroin pipeline fueled an epidemic that devastated New York in the 1970s. Thousands of lives were lost to addiction, families broken, neighborhoods torn apart. The money he made was built on suffering. And perhaps most damning of all, his decision to cooperate with law enforcement left him branded a traitor in the underworld, a man who had violated the very code that once defined him. In the end, Frank Lucas was both a legend and a warning. Frank Lucas lived until May 30th, 2019, when he passed away at the age of 88. His death closed the book on a man whose life embodied both the dream and the nightmare of power. Some mourned him, others shrugged, but no one ignored him. His name remains etched in American crime history. Even today, debates rage. Was Frank Lucas a criminal genius or a selfish opportunist? Was he a product of poverty and racism, or the architect of his own destruction? Was he a hero for beating the Mafia, or a villain for poisoning Harlem? The truth is complex. Frank Lucas was all of those things at once. A man driven by ambition, scarred by poverty, shaped by a ruthless world, and ultimately consumed by the empire he built. A man who built his own empire. A man who outsmarted the Mafia, bypassed the middlemen, and created a supply line so daring it stunned the United States government. A man who lived in luxury, who sat courtside in fur coats, who once boasted that he earned $1 million a day. And yet, a man who lost it all. Frank Lucas's story is not just about crime. It is about the cost of ambition, the illusions of power, and the inevitable collapse of empires built on sand. As the credits of his life rolled, the images are easy to imagine. A boy born into the red clay of North Carolina, running from poverty and racism, determined never to be powerless again. A young hustler in Harlem, learning the rules of the street under the watchful eye of Bumpy Johnson. A rising kingpin who dared to cut out the Mafia and claim the throne for himself. And then the peak. Blue magic flooding the streets. The fur coat at Madison Square Garden. The headlines whispering of a man who had beaten the Italians at their own game. Frank Lucas wasn't just a gangster, he was a myth walking in real time. But myths, no matter how powerful, are fragile. The very coat that made him famous also made him a target. The very money that made him rich also made him reckless. The very empire that gave him power also carried the seeds of his destruction. Frank Lucas thought he was untouchable, but no one is untouchable. The fall came hard and fast. Law enforcement raids, family arrests, millions in cash stuffed into shoeboxes, and finally, the image of Harlem's king in handcuffs. Convicted, sentenced to 70 years. The empire vanished overnight. And then came the betrayal, the cooperation, the testimony that toppled corrupt police and criminals alike. The choice that gave him freedom but cost him his legend. For the streets, there was no worse crime than snitching. Frank Lucas chose survival, but he would never again be respected in the underworld he once ruled. When he walked out of prison, Harlem had moved on. Crack cocaine ruled the corners. Violence ruled the blocks. And Frank Lucas, once the most feared man in New York, was reduced to a fragile man in a wheelchair telling his story to anyone who would listen. And yet, even in ruin, he remained unforgettable. Hollywood came calling. Denzel Washington gave him new life on the silver screen in American Gangster. A new generation heard his name, debated his legend, and asked the same questions Harlem had whispered for decades. Who was Frank Lucas? A genius or a criminal? A visionary or a poisoner? A survivor or a betrayer? A king or a cautionary tale? The truth, like his life, was never simple. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at 88 years old. He lived far longer than most gangsters ever do. He survived prison, enemies, the Mafia, and the streets. But the empire he built was gone. The wealth was gone. The respect was gone. All that remained was the story. And perhaps that's the greatest irony. Frank Lucas wanted power. He wanted money. He wanted to never be poor again. He achieved all of it, and then he lost it. But what remained, what history remembers, is not the money or the mansions, but the myth. The man who smuggled heroin in coffins. The man who defied the Mafia. The man who rose, who fell, and who became a legend told and retold across generations. In the end, Frank Lucas got something even bigger than money. He became immortal in story. But what do we take from that story? Some will admire him, seeing him as a symbol of ambition, a man who refused to bow to the Mafia or the system stacked against him. Others will condemn him, Seeing the addicts destroyed by his product, the families torn apart, the community poisoned for profit. And both are true. Frank Lucas was not a hero, but he was not only a villain. He was a reflection of the world. He came from a world of poverty, racism, corruption, and broken promises. He was the product of a system that left men like him believing that crime was the only path to power. The tragedy is not just that Frank Lucas rose and fell. The tragedy is that so many like him believed there was no other way. And so his story ends where it began, not in the glimmer of diamonds or the roar of Madison Square Garden, but in the quiet truth that empires built on destruction will always destroy their makers. Frank Lucas's empire died long before he did. What survived was the lesson that no matter how high you rise, no matter how much money you make, no matter how powerful you become, if your foundation is built on pain, it will collapse, always. This is the legacy of Frank Lucas, the American gangster. A man who built his empire, lost it all, and left behind a story the world will never forget.